Well, the holidays have come and gone once again, but if you've forgotten to get that special someone in your life a gift, well, Mint Mobile is extending their holiday offer of half off unlimited wireless. So here's the idea. You get it now, you call it an early present for next year. What do you have to lose? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Limited time 50% off regular price for new customers. Upfront payment required. $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan. Taxes and fees extra. Speeds may slow after 50 gigabytes per month when network is busy. See terms.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Professor of Law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Hey, Ken.
Hey, Michael, it's great to be back with you.
Yeah, it's been a while, and I am looking forward to it. Another, as usual, busy and tumultuous week. Though I want to say, before we do get started, I want to thank not just a new supporter, but a new supporter at our executive producer level, Sean. Thank you very much. I've contacted Sean. He hasn't cleared yet. He hasn't gotten back to me about whether or not he feels comfortable with me mentioning his last name and so forth. But Sean, you know who you are, and thank you so much. That was very great. Anyway, one other thing before we get started, I wanted to mention to folks. I was recently on another podcast, the Baraka BC2 podcast with Bill Cancel, who I've been on his show a few times before, at least once. And we talked about what happens when there's a mismatch between societal change and a society's political institutions. And I've got a lot of thoughts about that, which is why, in fact, at some point in the future, next couple of weeks, Michael Levy and I are going to be starting a series on just that and a bunch of other things kind of related to that. So anyway, just if you ever wanted to actually see me in action, this is your chance because Bill recorded the video interview on his YouTube page. I don't know why you'd want to see me. That seems like it would detract from your experience, but hey, knock yourself out anyway. I thought it was an interesting conversation. I'll post links to it in the show notes, both to YouTube and Apple Podcasts. So there you go. All right. So why don't we get started with, immigration. After more than, 70 days at this point, I think, 4,000 arrests and 2 American citizens killed by ICE agents, Operation Metro Surge is ending. Border Czar Tom Homan announced the end of what some on the left would call the occupation of Minneapolis, and Homan cited unprecedented cooperation from local law enforcement, specifically mentioning commitments from Minnesota to transfer undocumented inmates into federal custody and to help minimize what Homan termed unlawful agitator activity. That said, the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office, which runs the state's largest jail, said that its policy of not cooperating with ICE remains unchanged. And Minnesota Governor Tim Walz told reporters, my take was that they knew they needed to get out of here, but in a very Trumpian fashion, they needed to save face. Now, also this week, a federal judge in California struck down that state's law prohibiting masks for federal agents on the grounds that it was discriminatory because it didn't also apply to state and local enforcement. Now, that judge, Christina Snyder, a Clinton appointee, also ruled that the state could continue enforcing a law that required all law enforcement officers to display visible identification. The California legislator who authored the law prohibiting the wearing of masks by federal agents says that he is in the process of introducing legislation that would apply to state and local law enforcement as well. And so all of this happens in the context of those stalled out negotiations between Democrats and Republicans on the Hill on DHS funding, which runs out the end of today, February 13th, when we're recording this. And with the Senate out of session until the 23rd, that means we're almost certainly going to be seeing a DHS shutdown of at least 10 days. But because of that OBBB funding, still has tens of billions of dollars in funding. And so the shutdown will largely affect agencies like TSA, FEMA, and the Coast Guard, none of which are really central to the immigration fight, but all of which, too, will likely continue at just about full force because they're almost all considered essential personnel. So, Ken, there's a lot there. I thought we'd start with the end of Operation Metro Surge. And I'm wondering, do you agree with Governor Walz that the administration was basically run out of town and is trying to save face? Or do you think ICE accomplished anything meaningful during the surge?
I'm not sure I even agree that the announcement that ICE is leaving Minneapolis is true. You know, I don't believe it actually. I've kind of seen this drama before in the recent Trump administration in these districts where he's appointed acting interim U.S. attorneys for 120 days. Whenever the federal district courts get around to saying the 120 days is up, you're through. Uh, the outgoing interim U.S. attorney, whether it's Alina Hababa or Lindsay Halligan or whoever, they'll always make a kind of press conference saying, "Okay, I'm leaving now. It was an honor to serve the people of the United States," and then they just stay. So I haven't really seen a situation where there's a press conference where a Trump official announces that we're leaving and then they actually leave. I think it's misdirection. Although I can certainly see why Governor Walz wanted to, take it as a victory for the people of Minneapolis. Yeah, I also I don't know what legitimate things ICE was ever trying to accomplish in Minneapolis. I think they were mainly trying to terrorize the people of Minneapolis because it's a blue state filled with Trump critics, and so in that, I think I'm pleased to think that they failed at that, and that the people of Minneapolis really stood up to them.
Yeah, I think to me, a lot depends on, well, first or not, whether or not they actually leave. I'm a little less skeptical of that than you are, but we'll see, right? But also, I think a lot depends on whether or not Minnesota law enforcement actually does end up cooperating more with ICE. And to me, it seems to me that, I mean, the Hennepin County Sheriff's Department knew the statement they were releasing, and I don't see there being much incentive for them to change their tune, especially once ICE agents are gone, if they're actually gone. And so I think Governor Walz is probably right about that. It's not like Holman could say, well, you know what? We just gave up, essentially. So too bad. Minnesota wins, Minneapolis wins, we lose. So, but I guess pulling back even more, it's hard for me to imagine that those 4,000 arrests, even if all of them were legitimate, which certainly they were not, that they were worth the cost, because the administration started off with actually a pretty good issue. I mean, tens of billions of dollars in fraud, but the way they approached it was just the ICE surge totally pushed that issue out of public consciousness, and it also sank Trump's approval on immigration, which started out as a solid issue for him with the majority of Americans. But now you look at polls, and it's almost he's underwater on it almost entirely, not because the majority of Americans disagree in general. They just disagree with that that kind of serious, heavy-duty, heavy-handed enforcement. And so they took what could have been a good issue and turned it into a really awful issue for them. So I think it seems like to me kind of a failure on all around, really, for the administration.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree that it's a failure, but I think I don't know that the goals were ever what the stated goals were. I don't really believe that the goal was to deport undocumented aliens. And in fact, I don't think that the Trump administration even yet has actually done that at a much higher pace than the Biden or Obama administrations did. It's certainly possible to, deport undocumented aliens without occupying an entire city. And as you noted already, one of the easiest ways to do that is to maintain good relations with state and local governments, because if state and local governments actually have undocumented aliens in custody, they really do have a lot of incentive to cooperate with federal authorities. It just sort of gets these people out of their jails and that kind of thing. So, and I think that kind of cooperation was routine during the Biden and Obama administrations, and just made it a lot easier to get significant numbers of deportations. So I tend to think the whole thing was always like it was theater, but the purpose of it was really to terrorize the populations in the cities who weren't undocumented aliens, right? So you've got this huge show of force. You've got, people who are publicly opposing the administration's policies literally getting killed in a few cases. Sometimes just getting beaten up or detained or whatever. But I think that the target of this all along, was not undocumented aliens. The target of this all along was Democrats and Trump critics and people in states that are anti-Trump. And so in that sense, I still think it was a failure. And I think the people of Minneapolis, managed to not succumb, not be chilled in their opposition to the Trump policies, to drive them out. But that's kind of the metric that I would judge it by. If the goal was to kind of subdue and demoralize Trump critics, it's also a failure.
Yeah.
Just like if the goal was to deport undocumented aliens, it was also a failure.
Let's turn to Judge Snyder's ruling on California, both the masking law and the ID law. Let's start with the masking law. What did you think about her ruling with that? Did you agree with it? Did you see anything in it that you thought was, I don't know, not quite right, or what was your take?
One aspect of it that I can't say it was not quite right, but I would just say I don't fully understand it and I have to study it more. Because I really only saw this yesterday. But her idea that there's a constitutional doctrine that would say a state law that only regulates federal law enforcement but doesn't impose the same regulation on state law enforcement is unconstitutional. But that if they would go ahead and impose that same restriction on state law enforcement, then that could make it constitutional. That was, I think, the essence of her holding on the masking. That the reason that she sustained the ICE being allowed to mask is that state officials were not banned from masking under the same law. And so I think, there was already a California legislator who said, well, in that case, I'm going to introduce a new bill that will prohibit state law enforcement officers from masking. And then we can apply it uniformly. And then presumably under the logic of this district judge's opinion, then it could be enforced against both state and federal. I just don't fully understand that, really. I think she kind of didn't want to credit the Trump administration's argument that the Trump administration was arguing states don't really have authority to regulate anything about the way that federal law enforcement officers enforce federal law, and she rejected that argument. But I feel like that that's the more pertinent argument, really. Like I think there may have been something to that she was maybe a little hasty to reject. But if there was nothing to that, then I don't really see why it matters whether state regulates its own officers or not. I'm not fully seeing the relevance of that.
Well, and I know that in the past there's been talk about, well, states can set kind of general safety regulations like speed limits and things like that would apply to both federal and everyone else, essentially. But this to me seems like it's different in some way that I'm not entirely sure, even if that new law is passed and this judge in particular gives it the go-ahead, that it would survive appeal.
Well, even the speed limit thing that you talked about, I think it's more complicated. I mean, let's take a situation where you've got the FBI legitimately, pursuing a kidnapper or something, enforcing federal law. And so there's a car chase. And the FBI has to violate the local speed limit. I think they're entitled to do that.
Sure. Yeah.
So I actually don't think that there's this issue really about, well, is that exactly the same rule that would apply to a state or local officer? I think there is a legitimate scope where I'm partly agreeing with Trump here that federal officers should have some legitimate scope to enforce federal law, even if the federal law is in some conflict with state law. What I would think, the way I would have probably analyzed it was focusing more on, what is the legitimate scope here? And I don't think there is any legitimate reason that these officers need to be masked. And so I would say if I had been the judge, I would have kind of done it that way. I would have said, that federal officers who are, who need to violate a state law in order to enforce the federal law, I would say they presumptively do have a right to do that. And in that sense, I'm partly agreeing with Trump. But I think it would be appropriate for the court to ask the question, what are the masks for?
Yeah.
And it seems to me like the only thing the masks are for is so that the agents can get away with criminality and not be identified. And that's not really a legitimate reason.
No, sure. If that's the reason, that's definitely not legitimate.
Yeah.
I guess I'm torn on this issue. Last week on the show with Trey, I made what I thought was the strongest case for masking. And I'll say what ICE has said. They've released some statements saying things like, there's been an 8,000% increase in death threats against agents, more than a 1,000% increase in assaults against agents. But the problem here, and this is not something I'm noting some lefty thing, it's something that the Libertarian Cato Institute noted, is that, well, ICE doesn't actually publish any systematic data on threats, assaults, or injuries to agents. So 8,000% increase sounds like a lot, but you don't know what they're counting as a threat. You don't know what kind of base you're starting from, and their unwillingness to let anyone look at this data, I think, should raise a big flag. It does for me, certainly.
Yeah, I'd go much farther than that.
Okay.
I would say that as far as I know, and I think there is data on this, the number of cases in which, a member of the general public found out the identity of an ICE agent, went and tracked down that ICE agent at home and committed a crime against them, that's zero. It's zero. There's not 8,000 cases, there's 0 cases. And that's the relevant number, I think, here. That if they're saying, well, we don't want people to find out what their identity is because then people will somehow come to their houses and commit crimes against them, that's made up. That shouldn't be credited at all.
Well, I guess my default position is that law enforcement should be unmasked and should display ID. And if the state is arguing that they shouldn't do either or both of those things, they should have to meet a pretty high standard of evidence to demonstrate the need for masking and non-identification. And there are instances in which I agree that standard could probably be met, but it seems to me that it's very, very far from being met in this case, and the sort of evidence that ICE has presented is almost laughably short of that kind of standard.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And, of course, we have, centuries of experience in the United States with local, state, federal policing and law enforcement. Masking has been very, very rare. Requirements of producing ID are common and widespread. And, the harms that they're saying would happen just have never happened, and so I think it's a pretty easy case. So that's how I would have analyzed it. To me, it's not that relevant whether the state law happens to apply the same way to the state officers or not, though. So I wasn't totally in agreement with the judge's approach there.
Okay. What about the Democrats' fairly hardline strategy, I'll call it, on not funding DHS or not helping Republicans fund DHS until they get more out of Republicans than a seeming, at least an announcement of a withdrawal from Minneapolis, and the concession on body cameras and better training and some kind of vague commitment to modifying roving patrols? What do you think about the Democrats' stance on this?
Yeah, I think it's good, but it's not going to... Just like the previous shutdown in the fall, right? I think the previous shutdown in the fall was good. I was glad they did it. I was glad they shut down the government for 43 days and flexed their muscles a little bit, even though in the end you could say they ultimately had to cave and they didn't get anything for it because, that's what their base wants them to do. The base wants them to fight. They're not going to pay a political price for doing it. And even if they don't ultimately get the concessions they want, and I think that it's probably unlikely that they'll get any real meaningful concessions, I still think the exercise of, showing themselves fighting for things that their constituents want, and in this case, I think now the majority of Americans really do want. I think it's good politics, and they should do it. And they should, with Homeland Security, unfortunately, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act already funded the ICE, so they actually can't shut them down. So they're going to end up shutting down things like TSA and FEMA and stuff like that. But those workers are probably just going to mostly keep working without pay. They do have a statutory right to get all their pay in the end right now. And so I think even a lot of people who work for those agencies, although it'll be inconvenient to miss a paycheck or two, I think they even like to see some fight against the Trump administration. So I don't think it's, I think it's just doing something is invigorating, and that's the reason to do it.
Yeah. And I think this is true of both bases. I mean, the Republican base and the sort of at least left end of the Democratic base are not where most Americans are on this issue. And so, especially looking at Republicans, if people are wondering maybe why aren't they giving more than what are essentially cosmetic concessions, which I think at this point is all they've offered. I mean, I think we go back to something that actually Thomas Massie, one of the few Republicans who regularly criticizes President Trump, has said this last week. He said, well, just wait until after primary season, and I think you're going to see more folks pushing back in my party against Trump. And his meaning is that if you're a Republican in Congress, you're probably in a safe seat. Most of them are. And so your biggest concern is being primaried from your right. Once you get past that, then all of a sudden the calculus maybe changes a little bit. And maybe Massie is right about that. I think he probably is, though not maybe in a big way on that.
Yeah, it's hard for me to understand, Republican internal politics, so I'm not going to weigh in on that. But I do think that every poll shows that, in taking a stand against these ICE occupations of cities, substantially every Democrat wants to see the Democratic elected officials do that, and a lot of independents do also. So I think that's very good politics for the Democrats to do.
Yeah. And I mean, Republicans, for their part, are saying that, well, if they're going to give concessions, they want passage of the SAVE Act, that's that proof of citizenship to register to vote thing. They want crackdowns on so-called sanctuary cities. And I don't think Democrats are at all inclined to give them anything on that. And so who knows how long this could go on for. But I think this argument that some Republicans are suggesting, well, we could maybe win this shutdown because we can say, well, Democrats are for defunding airport security to protect illegal immigrants. Well, as you pointed out, because TSA and also FEMA, they're considered essential employees. Those services aren't going to stop. So I don't really think that this is I find it hard to see a way that the Republicans come out ahead on this issue right now.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe we're done, but I'll just say one thing to agree with you that that I think Trump has changed some underlying fundamentals of this kind of situation, because I think in the past, if a party shut down the government for a while and then ultimately didn't get their demands and then backed down and then the government just reopened, that would usually be pretty bad for the party that did that, historically. But I think because Trump is so much, inspiring from, all the people that aren't part of his base, just a feeling that, we need to see some fight. We need to see people fight against them. We need to see people do something that I think we really learned from the fall shutdown. The Dems basically did shut down the government for 43 days, get basically nothing out of it, and then just, say, okay, we're done now. And that's the kind of thing that would have been political suicide for a party in the past, but it was actually a winning thing for them this time, I think.
Well, I think it helps, too, that Republicans, at least nominally, are in charge. And so a lot of times the average American isn't going to be able to say, well, yes, but they don't have a filibuster-proof majority or something like that. And so it only takes a few massies to kind of throw a monkey wrench into things. But one last thing I want to point out on this issue is in talk of sanctuary cities, I think it's important to note that there is no legal requirement for state and local governments to use their resources to help federal immigration officials do their job. In fact, there's a 10th Amendment that a lot of Republicans and conservatives used to champion for years, saying, well, yeah, we shouldn't have these unfunded mandates. And that's different from actively impeding federal agents from doing their job, which can be legally problematic, to say the least. But what a lot of so-called sanctuary cities are doing is simply deciding not to extend cooperation they don't need to legally extend to federal agents. And there's nothing illegal about that.
No, I mean, actually, you alluded to this, but, that doctrine, that 10th Amendment doctrine, which the court calls the state executive anti-commandeering rule associated with the 10th Amendment, that is only a 30-year-old doctrine. We really didn't have anything like that until the mid-90s.
Right.
But in the mid-90s, when it was adopted by a 5-4 court on party lines. So, the conservative 5 majority adopted this anti-commandeering rule against the dissent of the 4 more liberal justices. And it was in a Brady Act case. It was about whether local sheriffs have to do background checks when people want to buy guns. And that was a case where, you had some local sheriffs saying, I support the Second Amendment and I don't want to do a background check. I just think anyone in my county that wants to buy a gun should be allowed to buy it. And it was totally a conservative legal movement that brought this case, that crafted this theory, and that got the court to accept it. So I do find it a little bit galling now, after, something that I would look at really as a doctrine that I don't really think is that legitimate. I think it only exists because of conservative judicial activism. But yet, now we have all the conservatives complaining about it.
And of course, it's not just the 10th Amendment. Now it's the 4th Amendment with, plenty of Republicans saying, no, authorities don't need a warrant to go and break into your home to pull an illegal person out. Or even, well, if you take a gun, even if it's registered to a protest, well, you're asking for trouble. So it's just weird to see how
Right.
2nd, 4th, 10th Amendment, these things that were conservative bedrock principles, which I think they still are. It just goes to show you that this right-wing populism of Trump is not conservative in so many ways.
Yeah, and I mean, when you say conservative, I just want to point out, we're talking about contemporary conservative. Like, these
Yeah.
are not long-standing conservative
Sure.
principles. These are 21st century conservative principles, or maybe they go back into the mid-1990s, but they really don't go back farther than that.
Okay, well, I am sure we'll be talking more about immigration, but for now, let's move on to something a little bit different, something we also talk plenty about: tariffs. This week, the U.S. House of Representatives voted to rescind President Trump's tariffs on Canada. They did this by voting to terminate the national emergency declared by Trump that he claims, at least, gives him the authority to impose those tariffs. Now, it was a close vote, 2-9 to 11. 6 Republicans joined all but 1 Democrat in supporting this measure. And, well, it does represent a rebuke to President Trump, Speaker Johnson. It won't have any practical effect because ending the emergency would require Senate approval, which means 60 votes to beat the filibuster. And then, of course, once Trump vetoed that, it would require 2/3 of both chambers, and that's just not going to happen. Underneath all this, of course, is what everyone's waiting for: the Supreme Court to rule in that Trump tariff case, because after taking the case up on an expedited basis and hearing oral arguments on November 5th, the court has yet to issue an opinion. And the justices would have almost certainly had their initial discussion and vote shortly after that. Most people think it probably happened at their November 7th conference. But more than 3 months later, we're still waiting to hear from the court on this. So I want to talk about both of these things. But Ken, let's start with the House's tariff vote. Do you think it means anything? I mean, does it signal a weakening of Trump's hold a little bit, or is it just that kind of small, unstable Republican majority in the House doing what it does? What do you think?
Well, I do think politically, the fact that Trump and Johnson, between them, couldn't stop this vote from being taken place does signify a weakening of Trump's hold over the Republican Party. And I think that hopefully is a trend that will accelerate. It also could have some minor legal significance. It may not, but it might. And the minor legal significance would be this: that to the extent that Trump is partly relying on constitutional authorities and not purely on statutory authorities, there's a famous doctrine called the Youngstown Steel Doctrine. I know that you're familiar with it. And, under Youngstown Steel, if there's kind of ambiguous questions about what kind of emergency powers does the president have, what can he do in the face of an emergency, one of the court's doctrines would say, well, one thing you look at is whether it seems like what he's doing is consistent with what Congress would want him to do or inconsistent with what Congress would want him to do. So here, Congress has very clearly expressed right now that this is inconsistent with what they would want him to do. And so, to the extent that any kind of Youngstown Steel analysis finds its way into the court's decision, I would think this would be relevant. However, I still think that probably the primary analysis that will wind up in the court's opinion is statutory analysis, not constitutional analysis, and that it will mainly be, has Congress already, through statutes that are on the books today, given him the authority to do this? And for that kind of analysis, the views of the current Congress as expressed through unenacted bills will not be as important as the Supreme Court's interpretation of the statutes that have already been enacted.
Yeah, when I look at the 6 Republicans who voted with all but one of those Democrats, I don't know what Jared Golden was thinking, but anyway, one of them's Massey, and Massey votes. He votes in a weird way on a lot of things, right? And not surprising, Trump is pushing for this big primary challenge to him. But 2 of the other votes against him were from guys who are retiring. Then there's another one from a guy who was redistricted out of his seat in California. So that's not really a ton of Republican resistance at this point, at least. And I should also point out, worth noting, that originally Congress could have ended this emergency through what was called a concurrent resolution. That doesn't require a presidential signature, but in a case that Ken is very familiar with, I'm sure he teaches it all the time, the Chadha case in 1983, the Supreme Court said, nope, that's a legislative veto, and that is unconstitutional. So that path is closed to Congress at this point.
Yeah, that's right. One thing I'll say about Massey and about the small size of the group that you noted, though, that small size may actually reflect more tacit agreement among some other House Republicans. I think what we are starting to see a little bit is that there's just a small handful of Republicans, Massey being the most obvious one, who are willing to consistently stick out their neck against Trump. But I think there's a larger group of Republicans who are sort of tacitly or surreptitiously saying we need to not go along with everything Trump's doing. And they're alternating, when they vote, So I think you might have a group of about 20 and they might be saying, okay, on this one, I'll be the one who votes this way. On that one, I'll be the one that votes this way, because they just need enough votes to tip the majorities in each vote, right? So I do think that this could represent more than that. I just want to also quote Massey, because he's the congressman that represents our workplace, or your former workplace and my current workplace. Yep. And we know him a little better, I think, than a lot of listeners all around the country might. And one thing that he said, which I just actually love, it actually made me, I don't usually donate money to Republicans, but when I heard this quote, I sent him a few bucks. He said, when Trump called him a fake Republican who was always with the Democrats, Massey says, well, I vote with Republicans 91% of the time, and the only times I don't vote with them are when they want to protect pedophiles, start wars, raise taxes, or bankrupt the country. And I just thought that's such a great line.
He is pretty quotable. We had him on the show years ago. I disagree with him on a lot, but it was one of my favorite interviews of all time. He actually seemed like he believed in things and was sincere about it. It was really kind of refreshing. I don't know, but
he has more rectitude and courage than just about anybody in the Congress.
Yeah, I think so, for sure. So I guess also point out that, what I think is a big bottleneck here is that a lot of people on Capitol Hill and the country in general are sort of hoping that the Supreme Court bails them out on this issue, right? I mean, what's your read on why it's been now over 3 months in this supposedly expedited case, and we haven't heard anything? Now, I know there's this old saying about the court, those who talk don't know and those who know don't talk. But I mean, we're gonna talk anyway. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we'll speculate, obviously, because we don't know. We can speculate. No. We're not saying we know.
Absolutely.
But I think there could be some good reasons or some bad reasons. So I'll just kind of canvass them all. I think that one thing about this case is, I think it's probably easier to come up with for each justice to come up with a decision on whether they think the tariffs are lawful or unlawful. I'm sure every one of them has already made up their mind about that, but harder for them to come up particularly on what the remedy would be if they decide that it was unlawful, right? So I tend to see the delay as signifying that they're going to strike down the tariffs, because I think if they were going to sustain the tariffs and they had the vote to sustain the tariffs, why wouldn't the majority who wants to sustain the tariffs just write an opinion saying we sustain the tariffs, this is over, Right. But I think we're in a situation right now where every lower court, so first it was the Court of International Trade, and then it was the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Every lower court said the tariffs are illegal. There were a couple of dissenting justices at the Federal Circuit, but a sizable majority sided with the Court of International Trade. So there's no court that's ever sustained these tariffs. And the Supreme Court, when they took the case, as you noted, they said, well, we're going to put a stay on all those lower court decisions for now. We're going to allow Trump to continue collecting the tariffs for now, even though the lower courts all said that it's illegal. But we're going to expedite things. And they made the lawyers work really fast to write their briefs, and they scheduled the oral argument probably the earliest possible date they could have. But now we have this delay. And so I think that they have come up with a vote, and to sustain or not sustain, and they're working on opinions. But, there's a lot of questions if they overrule them about what happens next. Do all the importers who paid them get a refund? Or is there any way that consumers can get a refund if the money was passed through to consumers? Is there any way that shareholders can get a refund, if the businesses had to subsidize? And so there's a lot of issues around that I think might have to be worked out. Another thing about the court and their practice is that we might be seeing multiple opinions in this case. It might not just be one majority and one dissent. Yeah. There might be some concurrences or more than one dissent. And the way they do their work, they will never release an opinion until every one of the 9 justices agrees, right, I've had enough time to respond to everything in every other opinion. So you can have this kind of iterative process where, they all write their first drafts, and then they all respond to what each other wrote. And then, there's things in those second drafts that the other people want to respond to. So there has to be a third draft. And, in a complex case with a lot of opinions, that can happen. So I think all of those would be very legitimate reasons why they're taking so long. Would just be, but I think would signify the likelihood that they're going to strike down the tariffs. Now, there less legitimate reasons might be that if this would also assume they're going to strike down the tariffs. But, sometimes the court just, even when they rule against Trump, they like to, throw him a lifeline and just let him play for time, and I think we see some of that with the shadow docket decisions and things like that. It's a partisan court. I often say it's a corrupt court, and I'll at least say here it's a partisan court.
Okay.
And so I think if they've decided that they have to rule against Trump on the law, I still think they want to, make it as painless for him as possible, and kind of dragging it out for a long time, will, let him, keep collecting the tariffs for a lot longer. It won't deal him that political loss sooner. And it may, they might be able to time the decision, like when something really big is going on. Otherwise, I mean, I suppose I would think this Minnesota stuff would have been something like that. Yeah. Something that's in the news that, would make this not the top headline. Right. I think they are not above doing that kind of political move. So, those could be bad reasons, but those are sort of all my thoughts. I don't know if you had other thoughts on why they're taking so long.
I guess I'll just say, going back to what we heard from the oral arguments, it would be stunning to me if they actually came out and upheld most or all of the tariffs. But also going back to the oral arguments, and this kind of plays into what you said, there seemed to be a lot of different reasons why they disagreed with those Trump tariffs. And that would kind of get into what you were talking about in the opinion writing, because for anyone who hasn't actually read kind of complex opinions with a lot of concurrences and dissents, it's really kind of fascinating in a way, because it's almost like they're having a conversation with each other. And you can tell that they've reviewed drafts. It's not like they're releasing these things independently for the first time. And it can be really interesting to read and to see them critique each other's reasoning in the actual opinions. And I don't know, I've always enjoyed that sort of thing, but I'm kind of weird and geeky about that. But I could see why it would take a while in this case, certainly.
One other kind of technicality I forgot to mention, I just want to throw it in, is I think it's most clear that they're probably going to strike down the tariffs that he imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. But he also imposed some tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. And I think those might be on a little bit firmer ground. So, I mean, if it was me, I'd overrule them all. But I think they've got, some of the conservative justices are going to defer to him a little bit more on those industry-specific tariffs, maybe. So I think in that case, they also have to they have to deal with these technicalities of which tariffs are in and which tariffs are out, and they may even have some disagreements amongst themselves even about those technical questions. So that's another reason it could get dragged out longer.
Yeah, I think so. And, some on the right would say, well, wait a second, putting constitutionality aside, which is something we do more and more these days, unfortunately, maybe, say, have the tariffs been all that bad? And I say, early on, experts were saying, or they would say so-called experts were saying, inflation is going to go up 1.5%, 2.5%, but to date, it's been closer to maybe 0.5% to just under 1%, and they've generated somewhere close to $300 billion in revenue at this point. They've given Trump a lot of leverage to kind of wring out other concessions from businesses, from foreign countries, that sort of thing. And so I think from a lot of folks on the right, at least who are kind of tariff curious or tariff supporters, say, well, I don't know, this is a great way to raise money. I'm sure you're not for this, but I'm kind of curious your take on that, Ken.
Yeah, well, you and I both just recently reviewed this study that was just done by the Tax Foundation. And the Tax Foundation, tries to quantify answers to some of the questions that you just asked. So, I haven't done any of this work myself, so all I can do is tell you what they said. But, the Tax Foundation's sort of comprehensive study found that the Trump tariffs amounted to an average tax increase per U.S. household of $1,000 per household in 2025. It's projected to be $1,300 per household in 2026. That the effective tariff rate, which is 9.9% now, is the highest average rate since 1946. That this is the largest U.S. tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993, and yet the amount of money that it's raising is not enough to offset the harm to the economy that it's doing, basically.
I mean, basically, what it ends up, as far as I can tell, is an incredibly efficient and regressive tax on Americans. And so that's not, yeah, and I say regressive because by necessity, lower income households spend a larger share of their income on consumption. And so it's a really bad tax. And this, yeah, okay. I kind of figured we'd agree on that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to see Congress impose a tax like this. If Congress decided to do it, it would be legal. I think Congress has the constitutional
Oh, sure.
authority to do it, but I think it's bad policy, and we certainly haven't seen Congress, impose taxes like this in any kind of express language at all. I know Trump is trying to strain to read existing statutes to do this, but if there was support for it, you've got a Republican House, you've got a Republican Senate, they could authorize it.
Yeah. Okay, just a quick message before we move on to our next story. When my gut is off, well, everything feels off. Digestion, energy, mood, even my focus. And every day, your gut's fighting a silent war against processed foods, stress, even toxins in the air. And when your gut struggles, your whole body feels it. Now, most probiotics never make it to your gut alive, which is why they don't work. But Just Thrive is clinically proven to arrive 100% alive and deliver measurable results. Just Thrive turns your gut into an antioxidant factory, creating protective compounds exactly where you need them most. And that means benefits like better digestion, healthy immunity, more energy, and easier weight management. Just Thrive Probiotic comes in capsules or berry-flavored gummies, so there's an option for everyone in the family. And for over a decade, Just Thrive has been helping thousands of people take control of their health with science-backed solutions you can trust. From their award-winning probiotic to their full line of gut, immune, and brain health supplements, Just Thrive is ready to help you live your healthiest life. And you can try Just Thrive Probiotic for 90 days risk-free. You could save 20% on your first order with code CX. So see the difference for yourself or get a full product refund, no questions asked. Just take the 90-day Just Thrive Probiotic Challenge today at justthrivehealth.com/CX. Be the best you with Just Thrive. Okay, so let's move on to the Department of Justice, Ken. This week, Attorney General Pam Bondi appeared before the House Judiciary Committee in what, in a saner time, I guess, would have been a more or less routine oversight hearing. We certainly do not live in a saner time, and as just about I think everyone predicted, things went very much like they did during Bondi's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee back in October. High theater, well, low theater, I guess. Insults, basically nothing of substance learned, aside from Bondi telling Republican Chip Roy that DOJ has investigations pending related to the Epstein files, which was vague enough to mean just about anything, I suppose. Now, when he returned to office, just as a reminder, just over a year ago, President Trump vowed that, in his words, never again will the immense power of the state be weaponized to persecute political opponents, and he pledged that his administration would, again in his words, restore fair, equal, and impartial justice under the constitutional rule of law. Now, to many observers, especially on the left, Trump's DOJ has done the opposite of this and become what may be the most politicized, least professional Department of Justice of all time, or at least in recent memory. And so, Ken, I'd like first to kind of get into the changes we've seen at DOJ in Trump's second term. But before we get into that, actually, what are your thoughts on AG Bondi's testimony this week?
Well, I mean, it was all theater, and it almost seemed like it was aggressive enough from her that really I'd have to say the goal of what she was trying to do was just to make the whole thing a fiasco as best she could. And maybe even chill the Congress from inviting her back again. Like, I think she would see it as a victory if she doesn't get invited back there again. So I think that's kind of what she came literally prepared, like for every district of every Democratic Congress member, plus Northern Kentucky, Massey's district. She came so that no matter what they asked her, she's going to say, well, in your district, this undocumented alien committed this crime, and you didn't even do anything about it, and you don't even want anything done about it. And that was basically her answer to every question, was to just blame the Congress members from different districts for random crimes that happened in their district when they're not even in law enforcement.
Yeah, it's just weird for me still to wrap my head around, because I've been checking out on congressional hearings for decades now, and to hear the Attorney General of the United States say to any member of Congress, you washed up loser lawyer. That's just, I mean, it's just like everything's become a tweet. It breaks my brain on some level, I suppose. And then when she's asked a question about DOJ and immigration, she responds by talking about the Dow and the S&P and the NASDAQ. It says that's what we should be talking about. And some member of the committee said, what does the Dow have to do with anything? It's like, what committee is this? You know, I felt like she was playing for an audience of one. And that, of course, would be Donald Trump, you know, and I'm sure Trump loved it.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that. That's I think the standard take on what she's doing. I think she was doing a little more than that, though. Okay. I don't think she was just playing to the audience of one. I think she was also actually trying to make the Congress think it's not even worth talking to her. I think she's looking to have, less supervision, less oversight, less accountability. And the more she just comes in there and just ruins everybody's day and accomplishes nothing, I think there's a goal. There's actually a goal there of not being invited back.
But I would think that differs. Well, that certainly would differ if Democrats had control of the House, because then all of a sudden subpoena power and other things are unlocked that they don't really have access to as a minority party. And the whole tenor of that, I imagine, would shift if, as most people predict, Democrats end up being in control of the House in 2029.
Well, I wonder about that. I don't really have the same confidence as you that her Justice Department would comply with subpoenas. I don't think they would do anything about it if the Congress voted to hold her or any subordinate in her department in contempt of Congress. She's not going to prosecute Todd Blanche or somebody like that if he's held to be in contempt of Congress. So, I don't know that we will get much more compliance. And I think her goal, no matter whether the Republicans nominally have the gavels or whether the Democrats do, either way, there's a lot of Democratic Congress members on these committees. They get the 5 minutes to ask her the questions. And I think she just doesn't want that at all. So I think stonewalling or just being as insulting and offensive and truculent as she was, that's a strategy, I think, for dealing with Congress, as well as like the audience of one thing. It's just to say, I'm not accountable to anybody. I'm not accountable to you. I don't care what you think about me. I think that's sort of the message that she's sending.
Yeah. Well, let's look to that larger issue of how Donald Trump has changed the Department of Justice, not just from the Biden DOJ, but I would argue from even the first term Trump DOJ. I have some thoughts on that, but I wanted to start with you on that. What do you see as being some of the biggest, most obvious changes?
Well, the effort to really, really run off the experienced civil servants ramped up a lot since the first Trump term. So I think already in the first Trump term, there was an effort to sort of politicize the civil service, but it wasn't being really done as much through kind of mass purges. I think it was just being done more through hiring, and that Attorney General Sessions and Attorney General Barr, I think, were instructing their U.S. attorneys to improperly and unlawfully take account of partisanship when they hired, but I don't think they were actually going so far as to just try to tell them, you just fire all the Democrats in your office. And so I think, that has definitely changed the complexion of it. There's also been some formal changes that support that. This is kind of very in the weeds stuff, but there's a schedule called Schedule F that Trump created inside the civil service. What it essentially does, the simplest way I could say this is that a lot of statutes classify that, within each department, some of the employees are political appointees and some of the employees are civil service. But the statutes don't always go down into the weeds of saying exactly which positions are political appointees and which positions are civil servants. So there's a little bit of room for the heads of departments to classify particular job positions that way. And they've done a massive reclassification from civil service to political appointment. So that actually formally means that partisan politics and alignment with the president's agenda is a legitimate job criteria for any job that's reclassified onto Schedule F. So they're not even hiding it as much. It's a really formal politicization of big chunks of the Justice Department that used to be part of the career civil service. And then finally, there's the elimination of certain parts like the public integrity section or the, which is gone now, or the nonpartisan pardon attorney's office, where there's no more office. There's just one pardon attorney now who's political, and things like that. So I think there's all those structural changes that are really designed to kind of fuse Trump's political operation with the Justice Department and not to maintain any separation.
I think we saw this right from the beginning. I mean, it started with what's been called the Bondi's zealous advocacy memo right at the beginning of her tenure, which essentially she reminded DOJ attorneys of their obligation to zealously advance their clients' interests. But she went further, saying, oh, by the way, if you don't do this, we might have to fire you, essentially. And that was followed by that executive order from Trump saying that no one in the executive branch could advance an interpretation of law that contravenes the interpretation of the president or the attorney general. And what we've seen is, as you point out, a pretty big staffing crisis. I mean, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to call it a mass exodus of attorneys, resignations, firings, forced transfers. Bloomberg Law did an analysis. They found that more than a third of senior career officials at DOJ had left within about 8 months of Trump's second term. And so that's a lot of top people. And so what you have a result is not the best people are not the remaining people. Reuters did an analysis from late last year. They found that there have been what they termed unprecedented prosecutorial errors, resulting in a 21% dismissal rate of criminal complaints in the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office over the 2-month period they examined, compared to a 0.5 dismissal rate over the previous 10 years. I mean, so it feels like it's just DOJ is being dumbed down by loyalty tests, and all the best people who kind of want to do their jobs are just, like we saw in Minnesota in the last month or so, just saying, nope, this is it for me.
Yeah, well, 2 things I want to say about Minnesota there. Number one, the departures are so extreme there that this is a U.S. Attorney's Office that's supposed to be staffed up with 50 prosecutors, and they're down below 20 now. And another thing about that office is that, the sort of predicate reason why ICE went to Minneapolis was this investigation of the Somali fraud thing. So every single career prosecutor who worked on that investigation and was prosecuting that case is gone. Yeah. That case is probably going to fall apart, right? And nobody's really, at this point, everybody that was the target of that investigation is not going to be convicted. And yet that was sort of the predicate reason that their ICE went to Minneapolis to begin with.
And it's amazing to me, the old joke used to be that you can indict a ham sandwich, but apparently I've never seen as many failed indictments. I mean, the most recent one was those 6 Democratic members of Congress who took part in that Don't Obey Illegal Orders video. But there was Comey, James, Powell. There've been a bunch of these indictments that just didn't go, and a sandwich guy. It just clearly they are pushing forward with horrible cases. I mean,
I'll say that there's like 2 reasons for that. I think they feed on each other, but the quality of the legal work being done by the prosecutors, of course, is going way down, which is sort of what you were talking about. But I also think that there's like this feedback loop where the big segments of the public are no longer inclined to believe Trump's prosecutors, right? So if you're talking about prosecutors trying to bring indictments against Democratic Congress members, I think many people, especially in Washington, D.C., which was the jurisdiction where that had to be done, that many of the kind of members of the general public who are going to be brought in and put on a grand jury, they're disinclined to believe the prosecutors to begin with. And then the prosecutors are doing shoddy work. So it's easy to disbelieve them. And so I think those 2 are both halves of the thing. But I think that it's going to, we probably don't even hear about all the cases where they fail to get an indictment, because that's actually not normally made public information. So there's some famous ones because everybody knew they were trying to indict these Congress members, and there was enough media interest in it that apparently some of the grand jurors just talked to them. But it's not like the Justice Department puts out a press release saying, hey, we tried to indict these Congress members and it didn't happen. And the grand jury is cloaked in secrecy. So really, unless a grand juror actually decides to go public with this information, we'd never hear it. And there probably are many more cases like that. Yeah. So I think the old days where the Justice Department had enough credibility that they could indict a ham sandwich, that was partly because people didn't believe that the Justice Department would try to indict that ham sandwich unless the ham sandwich was actually guilty of something, right? Yeah. And I think those days are gone now.
Yeah. And you also mentioned, kind of alluded to that, the pardon process. I mean, it's been personalized to a level that we've never seen before. I mean, so many times now, the Office of the Pardon Attorney, which was set up to try to put some sort of impartial-ish process. I mean, because pardons have always been, to a certain extent, for generations, kind of political, but not like this. And almost any analysis I've seen that wasn't linked to, extreme on one end or the other said that, no, it's pretty clear that things like your personal network, advocating in the media, having a relationship with Trump or someone close to Trump, they played a much bigger role in this than in any previous administration that we've been around to see.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention all the January 6th pardons.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I think the MAGA argument here is this. They would say, listen, the Obama and then the Biden Department of Justices directly and repeatedly went after Trump, both as a candidate and then as a former president, with the sort of intensity that was unprecedented. And so you have these deep state, Democrat-aligned DOJ personnel. They had to be purged from the agency because they were putting their thumb on the scale, hell, sitting on the scale, with their whole selves. And the rot was so pervasive in DOJ that after 8 years of Obama and then 4 years of Biden, well, drastic measures were necessary. And Trump at least is more honest than previous presidents about presidential involvement in DOJ decision-making. And that's a good thing, they'd say, both for the long-term legitimacy of DOJ as well as for democratic accountability, because presidents should control and then own all of the decisions that are made by the executive branch that they control. And they'd also point out probably that DOJ attorneys have leaned left for a long time, which makes sense because you have more leftist folks who probably end up in public service and in those more lucrative private sector jobs, and most of the elite law schools lean left. So it kind of makes sense the pipeline has a lot more liberals as well. And for all these reasons, we couldn't just go along with this rigged system, and big things had to happen. And of course, there are going to be some issues when we shake this system up, but it needed shaking. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with any of that. But so the first part of what you're talking about is what the conservatives would call the unitary executive theory, basically, and the idea that that the only way the government can really be held accountable is through presidential elections, and so therefore, it makes sense for the president to take a heavy hand in everything that the agencies do because, if the agencies were more independent, well, they don't get elected. So who would be holding them accountable? So I think that's the standard unitary executive argument. I think it's pretty wrong, though, because it doesn't take account of corruption at all. Right. And corruption is playing a big role in a lot of these decisions, I think, that we're talking about here. And B, we have both a lot of models from the states. Most states don't have a unitary executive. So in many states, for instance, attorney generals are elected separately from the governor. Right. They could even be the opposite party of the governor. And I would say that generally does redound to the public interest. And we have that example also in that that's the way, at least formally, that's the way the Justice Department has been doing it since the 1940s. And, usually, when you see lapses from that, like if you occasionally see situations where, you'd say, well, even though the president purports to be very separate from the Justice Department, here's an example of something where it sure seems like a friend of the president's got a break. You see that over the past 50, 60 years, but those are rare exceptions that people talk about negatively, right? So the norm obviously seems to have been both that's not the way the Justice Department should be run, and that not the way it should be run, and not the way it generally has been run, and that it's the occasional lapses from that norm that are blameworthy, right? Yeah. So to sort of take that to be an argument, well, we might as well just have lapses all the time, because, otherwise they'll just happen occasionally anyhow, seems to me to kind of put everything backwards, and that we could have a department with a lot of integrity. I mean, look, Joe Biden didn't even stop the investigation and prosecution of his own son. He eventually pardoned him, but he didn't interfere with the Justice Department there. And I don't think it has been the norm in any kind of way for presidents to try to fuse their political operations with the Justice Department's operations. I remember one time when Janet Reno was Attorney General and Bill Clinton was president, it happened that they were in Los Angeles airport at the same time for a few minutes, and he went over and talked to her on her plane, and that was a scandal. That was a scandal, right? And that there might be some coordination going on between the White House and the Attorney General's office because they actually had a conversation with each other for a few minutes when nobody else was around. And now that's basically what Trump is saying. Is what he wants to do 24/7. Not just once every now and then.
What about that argument that the Department of Justice and career employees there tend to lean left and put their thumb on the scales? And do you think there's anything to that?
Not really. I mean, I think in theory that could be a valid argument, but I think in practice it's not, because I think, the way the Justice Department was always structured, all of the top positions are political appointees of the current president, right? And so, if you're talking about something like, should the January 6th people have all been prosecuted, that's not a decision that career civil servants could make. Right. They would actually have to get that vetted and approved, at higher levels, or oftentimes, they wouldn't even be assigned to that case unless the higher levels had already decided this is a case we're going to pursue and then we'll assign you. So I think the level of political discretion that the career civil servants ever had was basically non-existent. Like the most they could ever do would be to suggest that something ought to be investigated, and then if somebody took that suggestion, then they could do it. But I think much more often, all the kinds of decisions about what kinds of cases are we really going to pursue, what are going to be our priorities, how much are we going to, do campaign finance cases or public corruption cases, or how much are we going to de-emphasize that, how much are we going to worry about antitrust, or how much are we going to de-emphasize that? All of those are always made by political appointees that are part of the current administration. None of those are made by these career civil servants.
All right. Well, there's so much more that we wanted to talk to. We're going to have to leave that for our supporters exclusive midweek show. So we hope you tune in for that on Tuesday. It drops every Tuesday. But if there was anything we talked about on this episode you disagreed with, or you have a question about, or we'd really love to hear from you, you can reach us in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, also Facebook and X. We always put links in the show notes. And, of course, there's our Discord discussion forum for supporters as well. And if you're a supporter, you don't get just that. You get ad-free versions of everything we release, including the full-length midweek episode instead of just a preview. And there's other things as well. We hope you will check that out. You can always check that out by clicking on the support link in our show notes. And now, if you would like to support the show, you'd like to get that full midweek episode, but you're just not financially able to do that, we totally get that. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll make sure you get the full midweek episode every single week. And regardless of whether you're a supporter or not, it really helps us a lot if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you're using, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, as always, I want to close with a very special thanks to our fantastic executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean this week. Sean, if you'd like me to mention your last name in these credits, I'm happy to do it. Just let me know, but I always default toward greater rather than lesser privacy. Anyway, with that, I'll close. We will be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,